I thought I knew my wife. I thought I knew my life. But one unexpected discovery shattered everything, leading me down a path of betrayal, secrets, and a revenge plan no one saw coming. Hello, Mike. This is Chris Harrington, Jenny Palmer's brother-in-law. I was hoping to speak with Colin, I said, but before I could hear a response, the call was abruptly cut off. A loud scream from my wife, Mary, followed by a persistent knocking on the locked door of my home office, shattered the moment. I hesitated for a few minutes before deciding to redial Mike and Colleen's home phone. However, before I could utter a word, Mike's voice came through, sharp and threatening. He warned me that if I called again, he would report me to the authorities. I stayed calm. Mike, listen, I understand, I said, pausing briefly. But you need to understand two things. First, I don't care if you involve the authorities. Second, I will be speaking to your wife, and there's not much you can do to stop me. Have a good evening. Oddly enough, I found myself enjoying the call, despite the relentless knocking on my office door. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let my thoughts drift to the decision I had to make at the end of this turbulent day. Should I reach out to my brother? Mary's words from earlier echoed in my mind. She had looked at me with an unexpected seriousness. You know, we've known each other our whole lives, she said. Why are you only telling me this now? I was caught off guard. What do you mean? I asked. She playfully hit my shoulder and laughed. I mean, it was really great of you to let me go to prom with Jimmy Bain. He was so shy and awkward. If you hadn't encouraged it, he probably never would have gone. Jimmy Bain. The name brought back memories. He had always been a quiet, bookish guy, definitely on the nerdier side and, if I had to guess, likely on the spectrum. He and Mary had grown up as neighbors and she had always looked out for him. It hadn't surprised me when she agreed to be his prom date. Years passed and I hardly thought about that night. It wasn't until 2 years after graduating college that I saw Mary again. By then, I was working as a full-time engineer at a defense contractor. One evening, while out at a bar with some colleagues, I unexpectedly ran into her. We chatted briefly, reminiscing about old times, before returning to our respective groups. For the next hour, I couldn't shake the feeling that fate had brought her back into my life for a reason. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. A battle raged in my mind. Should I follow her to the parking lot when her group finally dispersed? The decision lingered in my thoughts, but a small smile formed on my lips as I watched Mary's friends leave, one by one, until she stood alone. Do you think your company will accept the offer this time? Tony's voice pulled me back to the present. I shrugged. Honestly, I don't know. I still don't understand why our last 2 proposals were rejected. Tony pondered for a moment before replying, You and I have worked together for years and we've built a strong rapport. Maybe they're testing us, seeing if we're too close. I grinned, nodding. Funny, I had the same thought. Letting out a deep breath, I stretched and shrugged again, trying to shake off the tension. How about a drink? Tony suggested. I reached into my bag, pulling out my notebook. I'd love to, but I have over 30 pages of notes to go through from today's negotiations. It had been an exhausting day, long discussions, unexpected setbacks, and worst of all, a betrayal I never saw coming. My mind was so consumed with it all that I didn't even realize someone had taken the seat next to me until I noticed a hand extended in my direction. Hi, I'm James, the general manager of Marriott, the man said with a friendly smile. I shook his hand. Chris Harrington. I've booked conference room L122 for today. James nodded in confirmation, then tilted his head slightly. I happened to notice you were taking photos of a couple who just arrived. Do you know them? His words caught me off guard. My thoughts raced back to earlier that afternoon when I had gone up to the 8th floor to check the meeting rooms. The image of the woman flashed in my mind, her familiar outfit, the way she moved. Before I could gather my thoughts, my gaze landed on Mike's left hand. The wedding band gleamed under the dim conference room lights. I let out a bitter chuckle. Nice ring, Mike. I see you're just as much of a lying, cheating scumbag as my dear sister-in-law. Mike's face turned crimson. His jaw clenched as he leaned in, voice low and seething. You don't know what's going on, he hissed. Stay out of this or I swear I'll... He didn't have to finish. I knew exactly where this was going. I shook my head and sighed. I'm sorry if that upsets you, Mike, I said, my tone calm but firm. By the time I got home, Mary was already waiting for me in the doorway that connected the garage to the kitchen. Her arms were crossed, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. Where have you been? What's going on? She asked as I stepped past her and into the kitchen. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I set down my work supplies on the counter, my mind still racing. That's when I noticed Mary's phone sitting on the kitchen table, right next to a half-empty glass of wine. Something about the way it was left there felt off. A quiet suspicion crept in. Without hesitation, I picked up her phone, entered the passcode and opened her messages. My stomach twisted as I scanned the screen. She had already read the message I had sent earlier. I leaned against the kitchen archway and began counting on my fingers. "First," I said, my voice controlled but cold, "my relationship with your sister will never be the same. Now that I know the truth about her, every holiday, every family gathering will be a reminder of her betrayal." Mary's face tightened, but I continued. "Second, you knew about all of this. You were aware of her deception, and yet you said nothing. Which makes me wonder, do you approve of what she's done?" "Chris, that's not fair," Mary said quickly, her voice laced with frustration. I scoffed. "Isn't it? And while we're on the topic, Mary, you always bring up how Scott travels all the time for work. But you conveniently forget that I travel too, at least once a month. Do you think that changes anything?" She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, clearly scrambling for the right words. I sat down at the kitchen table, settling into the chair across from her. Taking a slow sip from my glass, I let the warmth of the alcohol spread through me. I studied Mary, watching the way her mind was racing, the way she was preparing for the next round of this inevitable argument. I was exhausted, completely drained. And I knew another drink wouldn't fix that. Just as I braced myself for whatever she was about to say next, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Irritated, I yanked it out and glanced at the screen. It was in that moment, staring at the glowing notification, that the weight of everything truly settled on me. The chaos, the betrayal, the realization that no matter how much I tried to make sense of it, I wasn't the one to blame for all of this destruction. The next morning my alarm went off at 5 a.m. just like always. But instead of heading downstairs for my usual workout in our basement gym, I took a quick shower, got dressed, and left for work without a word. I wasn't trying to escape Mary, I simply had to get to the office. I needed to finalize the memorandum of understanding and send it over to Tony. Thursday turned out to be more chaotic than I expected. Tony and I spent a solid 45 minutes on the phone hashing out the final details, but eventually I got the document completed and submitted. Work had my full attention for most of the day, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the tangled mess of personal drama that had been unfolding. Steve had always considered Scott and me good friends, while my mother-in-law, Betty, prided herself on being a savvy businesswoman. She owned and managed a well-known local real estate franchise with an impeccable reputation. But anyone familiar with the business knew the truth: Steve was the mastermind behind its success. Betty may have been the face of the operation, but it was Steve pulling the strings behind the scenes. "Maybe you should sit down," Mary suggested, patting the chair beside her. I shook my head. "I've been sitting all day." Steve's voice cut through the air, frustration evident. "I can't believe you think so badly of her." I knew I had to tread carefully. I didn't want to push Steve into turning against me. So I made a conscious effort to lower my voice, softening its edge as I met his gaze. "Then prove it," I challenged. Silence stretched between us. After a moment I continued, "That's exactly the problem, Steve. You can't prove that Mary didn't betray me." Despite his protests, I stood my ground. "For 6 years I trusted her without question," I said firmly. "And last night I finally told her." Before I could finish my thought, a voice interrupted from behind me. "Hey, I bet you forgot about me." It took me a second to register the man standing in front of me. Then it clicked. "Mike," I said flatly. He smirked. "I heard Colleen dumped you. How's it feel to be a deadbeat dad?" My jaw clenched, but I kept my composure. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Carl and Joe watching, clearly expecting some kind of sharp exchange. Mike's grin widened, but before he could say anything else, I met his gaze and replied, "Yeah, looks like. I'm the reason for your divorce?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Mike let out a chuckle and shrugged. "I think I played a part in it too. In a week I'll be out of a job," he added. At first, his words lingered in the air, heavy with tension. Then, unexpectedly, I started laughing. Not because it was funny, but because I could see it in his eyes. He had underestimated me. And now he was scrambling to figure out his next move. "Do you know I grew up in this city?" I asked casually, watching his expression shift. Mike scoffed. "What difference does that make to me?" This was turning into something much bigger, but I wasn't about to rush it. I leaned in slightly. "I know every mover and shaker in town," I said, letting the words hang for a moment. Then, seeing his unimpressed reaction, I added, "And I also know its darkest corners, the nastiest parts people like to keep hidden." His smirk faltered. If I were you, I continued smoothly, I'd consider leaving this city while you still can. Mike didn't respond. Not immediately. He was weighing his options, but I had made my point. Later that evening, I met with our legal team to discuss the next steps. We explored the possibility of suing the insurance agency where Jenny and Mike worked, but in the end, we decided to follow the advice of our divorce lawyer. We had been sitting at the table for over an hour when Sam Malone walked into the bar. His presence was impossible to miss. He scanned the room, spotted me, and started making his way over. Along the way, he paused at a few tables, shaking hands and exchanging greetings. Sam was older than Scott and me. His daughter, Trish, had been a grade below me in school. He owned one of the biggest auto recycling businesses in the area, and he carried himself with the authority of someone used to being respected. When he finally reached us, his expression was unreadable. Then his eyes locked onto mine and something inside me tensed. "What the hell happened to my daughter?" Sam asked, his voice low but sharp. I barely had time to react before he continued, his words striking like blows. "Some guys dragged her under the bleachers at the baseball field," he growled. "Was that you?" I let out a long sigh and shook my head. "No. I was practicing on the tennis court nearby." His fury didn't wane. "What did those do to her?" His eyes burned with rage. "When I got there, they had already torn off her shirt and were trying to get her shorts off," I said, my voice steady despite the painful memories. Sam clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. Days passed and exhaustion weighed on me like a lead blanket. One night, I sank into the corner chair of my hotel room, the worn cushions swallowing me whole. Closing my eyes, I let my mind replay the events of the past few weeks. It became clear to me then, Mary had never been able to admit to her affair with Mike. Not because she didn't want to, but because my unwavering stance against her sister's betrayal had made her certain that I would divorce her if I found out. And she was right. Yet as I sat there, contemplating the end of my marriage, I couldn't help but wonder, was it truly over? Or had this storm simply revealed a truth I had been refusing to see all along? I couldn't shake the thought, would I have handled things differently if Mary had actually been home on Wednesday? Would I have been fair? After leaving the hotel that morning, I made a stop to confirm that Mary's car was parked at work. Once I was certain, I discreetly slipped a GPS tracker beneath her seat. It took me several hours to set up everything I needed at home, equipment, props, and the final touches. By early afternoon, my preparations were complete. At 2 p.m., I lit a fire in the living room fireplace. Mary and I had spent so many winter evenings here, curled up together with glasses of wine, watching the flames dance. We used to talk for hours in the warm glow, lost in the comfort of each other's presence. But those nights felt like a lifetime ago. I glanced toward the top shelf of the bookcase, gesturing at the empty space where Mary kept a collection of books, most of which I had never touched. There were plenty of others we could have used to fuel a fire, but I wasn't interested in burning pages. As we spoke, I rose from the couch, taking Mary's wine glass from her hand before passing it back to her. I watched closely as a series of emotions flickered across her face: confusion, realization, then anger. Her father had once given her a beloved children's book on her birthday, a new edition published just a year earlier. On the first blank page, he had written a heartfelt message. That memory used to bring her joy. Now her face was tight with something else entirely. A sharp voice cut through the moment. "What happened to your face?" I turned my head slightly, exposing the bruising on the left side. "My wife hit me," I said evenly. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Why did she hit you?" I measured my words carefully. "Lately, Mary has become increasingly aggressive, verbally and now physically. I believe she's struggling with guilt. She's having an affair, though she thinks I don't know. I had planned to serve her with divorce papers tonight." The officer exchanged glances with his colleagues. "If we talk to your wife, will we find any injuries on her?" he asked. One of the younger officers stepped forward, ready to intervene if needed. The lead officer approached Mary, envelope in hand. "Are you Mary Harrington?" he asked. Mary hesitated but then nodded. Without breaking eye contact, the officer extended the envelope toward her. "Mary Harrington, you are hereby served. In addition to the divorce papers, this notice includes a restraining order preventing you from approaching Christopher Harrington, his home, or his workplace." The weight of the moment settled between us. Mary's hands clenched at her sides. Then, without another word, the officer stepped forward and placed her in handcuffs. The officer took the envelope from my hand, glancing over the contents before stepping back. For a long moment, neither Steve nor I spoke. We sat there in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. Memories, regrets, unspoken words, everything swirled between us, heavy and unrelenting. Finally, Steve broke the stillness. He stood up slowly, walked around the table and without hesitation, pulled me into a tight embrace. He let out a long, weary sigh against my shoulder before stepping back. As he made his way toward the door, his movements were slow, almost labored, like a man carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of burdens. When he reached the threshold, he turned back, his eyes dark with disappointment. "Burning those books," he muttered, shaking his head. "That was a shitty thing to do." With that, he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. But I knew this wasn't the end. Hatred burned in Mike's eyes, and I could tell he was already imagining ways to get back at me, ways that could stretch on for months, maybe years. There was no doubt in my mind that our paths would cross again. And I wasn't willing to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. That's why I arranged this meeting. Mike turned slowly, taking his time with each step. I watched his face carefully, reading every flicker of emotion as I spoke. "Mary Marie Charmant from Milford, Connecticut," I said. His jaw clenched, but he didn't react. I took another step forward. "Susan Berg from White Plains, New York." Still nothing. But I saw the way his shoulders tensed. Across the room, she moved gracefully around the table, her presence as effortless as ever. Even in a hoodie and with her hair pulled into a simple ponytail, she still carried herself with an undeniable elegance. She leaned in slightly, pressing a soft kiss to my cheek before settling into the chair opposite me. "Are you as nervous as I am?" she asked. At first, I found it an odd way to start a conversation. But after a second, I thought about it, really thought about it. I shrugged. "Not nervous," I admitted. "More worried. I just want this to be over. I want to move on with my life." Her expression shifted, and as she blinked, a single tear traced down her cheek. "He's blackmailing me," she whispered. "Mike, he's going to release a video." I exhaled slowly, already knowing what was coming. But then she hesitated, looking at me with something close to desperation. "You were absolutely faithful in your first year of college, weren't you?" I shook my head. Her question didn't matter. Not anymore. "Whether you agree with me or not, I doubt you've ever truly trusted me," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Let's be honest, there's no trust left between us and we both know why. You're constantly twisting words, bending the truth. It's hard to believe anything you say." Mary tried to steer the conversation in another direction. "I haven't seen Mike since all of this started," she said casually, as if that might smooth things over. I responded with a knowing grin, and she immediately tensed. "How's Mike's domestic violence case going?" she asked, clearly trying to gauge my reaction. It took another 7 months before the divorce was finalized. After selling the house, I made sure Mary got her share of the proceeds, then packed my bags and moved to a new city, far from the mess she had left in my life. I kept my job, but everything else changed. Scott and I, still grappling with the aftermath, found some dark humor in our situation. We posted old photos and videos of our ex-wives on social media, knowing full well the embarrassment it would bring them. More than once, we heard stories of people stopping them in the street, teasing them, poking fun at them. It wasn't exactly mature, but after everything they had put us through, we didn't care. For now, I have no interest in dating. My focus is entirely on work. Scott, still divorced, remains in the same city. As for Steve, he calls me every now and then to check in, asking how life's been treating me. "Do you remember the last convention when they were here?" someone asked. Natalie's voice cut through my thoughts. "Of course I do," I replied. "That memory always comes back to me when I make breakfast for the kids in the morning." She gave me a look, a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "I still can't believe you had the nerve to name your child Jared," she said, shaking her head. Steve, overhearing, chimed in. "You don't understand," he said defensively. "Jared is my son." I exhaled slowly. Steve didn't see it, couldn't see it. There was no resemblance, nothing tying them together. But he had convinced himself otherwise, and nothing I said would change that. The conversation grew more awkward by the second. My mind drifted, mentally retracing the events of 8 years ago. Natalie, Katie, and the weekend plans that had unraveled everything. "Are you good with us heading out on Friday and coming back Sunday evening?" Natalie asked. "Yeah, that works for me," I replied. "Have fun." She disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard her calling Katie to confirm their plans. If the weight of what she had done, her betrayal, the consequences that should have followed, bothered her at all, she certainly didn't show it. Later that night, I told her I needed to finish up some work on my computer before heading to bed. In reality, I had something else in mind. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for, the website for the East Coast Medical Equipment Dealers Conference in Lancaster. A few clicks later, I had everything I needed. By Monday morning, either my wife or a sharp divorce lawyer was going to have a very interesting conversation. I canceled all my credit cards, closed our joint checking account, and opened a new one in my name only. From this point on, Natalie would have no access to my finances. I planned to lock up the house as well, forcing her to find somewhere else to stay. I knew she'd probably figure out some way to get inside, but by then, I hoped I would have dealt with the more pressing issue, our son Jared. Even though he wasn't biologically mine, I still felt responsible for him. We could figure things out later, but I needed a backup plan. A few years ago, my parents had moved to a farmhouse in a rural area near Lebanon. It was far too large for just the two of them, but my father had always dreamed of owning land. He planted a sprawling vegetable garden, cared for a flock of chickens, and maintained an orchard. Jared loved visiting the farm. When I reached out to my parents, they welcomed us without hesitation. "Stay as long as you need," they assured me. My father had always called Jared Jake, never bothering to correct himself. But despite that small detail, he treated him with love and kindness. One evening as we sat outside, Jared finally spoke up. "You're not happy, are you?" he asked. I looked at him, surprised by the sudden question. "Not everything is going smoothly," I admitted. "I can't quite put my finger on it, but something feels wrong." Jared hesitated before saying, "Mom is unfaithful." A long silence followed. I wasn't sure what to say. Doubt gnawed at me, but deep down I knew he was right. Jenny turned away and walked upstairs. Lynn, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward. "You were right," Jenny murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does it all mean?" I asked, my mind still trying to process everything. "I think it's best if Lynn explains," she replied. Lynn approached cautiously. "Should I?" she asked. Jenny nodded. "Yes. He knows now, but you still have to tell him." Lynn took a deep breath before speaking. A few days later, I arranged a meeting at the company. I requested a few minutes with Mr. Turkett, and his secretary informed me that he would likely be able to see me. I had always gotten along well with Turkett's secretary, Helen. She was sharp, efficient, and had a way of keeping things running smoothly. I had a feeling she had a soft spot for me as well. When Mr. Turkett stepped out of his office, he greeted me with a firm handshake. "I hope you've got good news for me," he said with a polite smile. I hesitated before answering. Instead, I turned to Helen. "Would you mind bringing some coffee to the office and holding my calls for a bit?" She nodded and disappeared down the hall. As we stepped inside, Turkett gestured for me to sit. "Steve, how can I help you?" Helen returned shortly after with 2 cups of coffee, setting them down before giving me a brief, knowing glance. She had always fascinated me. Taller than average, with a quiet but commanding presence, she carried herself with the confidence of an Amazon warrior. I couldn't help but wonder how Floyd had managed to land her as his secretary. As I took a sip of coffee, I steeled myself for what I was about to say. I later learned that she had requested a transfer to my office 3 times, but my current secretary had refused to step down. "You're going to need these," she said, handing me 4 blank discs. I took them, glancing at her curiously. "Check the pending accounts and flag Stoddard," she continued. "Make copies, for yourself, your lawyer, and our legal team." Her tone was serious, and I knew better than to ask too many questions. Meanwhile, I had another task to focus on. I had positioned cameras to record every inch of the room, ensuring nothing would be left unseen. Stealth was my specialty, and I took extra care to ensure that none of the guests suspected a thing. 3 hidden smoke detectors in the room held the key to everything. Returning to my room, I changed clothes and methodically laid out my equipment. The pizza delivery arrived about 30 minutes later, right on schedule. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, everything was set. Both cameras were working flawlessly, capturing crystal-clear images even in the natural light filtering through the windows. My laptop was running smoothly, seamlessly connected to the feed. Despite my focus, frustration simmered beneath the surface. If I hadn't been so locked into my task, I might have been preparing for a confrontation instead. I quickly left the room and headed for the stairwell at the end of the hallway. Peering around the corner of the building, I spotted Natalie and Katie in the hall, laughing like schoolgirls. Moments later, Jared and Martin stepped out of the elevator, with Natalie following closely behind. She reached for Jared's hand and pressed a kiss to his cheek before the group made their way toward a sleek black car parked outside. As I watched from a distance, I heard Natalie's voice, playful and teasing. "The winner gets the first 3, she announced, sending a ripple of laughter through the group. Martin chuckled. And how exactly are we supposed to pull off a threesome with only 2 guys? Natalie's grin turned mischievous. Who says it has to be just guys? She added, her voice dripping with suggestion. Katie and Natalie exchanged glances before bursting into laughter. In a single fluid motion, they stripped off their tops and bras, flashing wide, daring smiles as they turned toward the men. With a mix of amusement and anticipation, Katie called out, "Well? Are you two just going to stand there?" The guys hesitated only briefly before reaching for their belts. I felt my stomach twist as I turned away. I had seen enough. I couldn't wrap my head around what was happening. We had all played a part in this, yet somehow, it felt like reality was slipping further from my grasp. If he had been paying attention, if he had truly been aware of the world around him, he would have figured it out by now. A single letter in the mail would have been enough to clue him in. It wouldn't hurt to send a birthday present every now and then, someone suggested. Yeah, that would be nice, another voice agreed. Something small, just enough for him to see it and understand what's really going on. Katie scoffed. For crying out loud, I've got 3 kids running around my house, and my idiot husband isn't the father of any of them. And there he sits, drowning himself in beer, too clueless to realize the drinks in front of him aren't even his. The tension in the air was thick, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Natalie caught on to what was happening. We had to move before that happened. We had arranged for a van parking spot near Hagerstown, making it easy to jump onto the highway first thing in the morning. The girls had planned the trip for us and had done a great job. The only thing I changed was the timing between stops. Gas prices had skyrocketed, and I wasn't about to waste money on unnecessary detours. Fortunately, I had brought plenty of cash. After spending 3 days at Disney, we were now en route to Chattanooga to visit the aquarium. "Hey Mom, it's Jenny," I heard from the back of the van. She was checking in, making sure things were running smoothly back home. Meanwhile, legal matters were still in motion. In order for my parents to obtain full custody of Jared, there were a few more steps to complete. The biggest hurdle? Convincing Natalie to agree to it. That was Seymour's job, and out of everything he had handled so far, this was the one task he seemed genuinely nervous about. What Natalie didn't know, however, was that my father had already taken action. Without her knowledge, he had legally changed Jared's name to Jake. By the time the dust settled, the girls had transitioned into their new school in Burlington, enjoying a beautiful Vermont summer. Once they were fully settled in, Jake and I returned to Pennsylvania. Later that week, after speaking with Mr. Turo, I learned that the pieces were finally starting to fall into place.